Next, we'll see a bit more template syntax and also discover how we can take advantage of control flow techniques for rendering content in a loop, as well as toggling the display of elements. If the list of sports here was something that we needed to pull from a database or an API and render dynamically without knowing how many there were, it might be helpful to be able to loop through the values as we render the associated form controls. We can accomplish this easily using a single div element with the v-for directive. And this takes an expression of the form item in collection. So for example, I might use interest in interests. Although I could use any identifier for the first part, like sport or I, for example. This will refer to a new array called interests, which contains the complete list and not just the ones that the user has selected. And I'm just going to reset this to default to an empty array there. So this will have the effect of looping through the interests array and adding a new div to the DOM for each item. That means that we'll want to bind each individual interest to the value attribute. And we can do that with vBindValue or the shorthand :value. We still want vModel equals selected interests, but instead of hard coding the name here, we'll use string interpolation on interest. I'm just going to click Workspace over here to close that panel to give us a little bit more space. Refresh the page, and you can see that with a single div element and the v-for directive, I get the same result but with a bit more flexibility. If I wanted to hide this section that shows what was selected until at least one item was checked, I could use the vShow directive. This takes an expression that can be evaluated as a Boolean. If we just give it selectedInterests.length is greater than 0, or even just selectedInterest.length, then it will only be shown when the user has selected at least one item. If we examine the DOM in the developer tools again, we can see that that had the effect of hiding the element with CSS when there were no checkboxes checked. Another option we have is the vIf directive. When we use that, it has the effect of completely removing the element from the DOM when that expression is false. So now you can see that it's been replaced with an empty HTML comment. So use vShow to avoid potential performance costs if you need to toggle the visibility of an element frequently, and use vIf when you don't expect that Boolean value to change. We can also use the vElse directive on an element immediately following one with vIf, which will be rendered when the if condition on the previous element fails. For instance, we might display, please select at least one interest as long as nothing has been checked yet. So now we can easily toggle between those two paragraphs. And we can do that without having to write code to manually show and hide mutually exclusive elements. We also now have a vElseIf directive so that we can add an arbitrary number of cases. For example, I could make the first vIf check for a specific case that I want to treat as an exception. For example, if all three checkboxes are checked, I could add a different message. And then use vElseIf for the normal check for at least one item. So now we have three possible results for the rendered page. vElse and vElseIf don't work with vShow, but you could always just use additional vShow directives with any test conditions that you need. A more common scenario might involve an array of objects with IDs and names, instead of just a single array of names. So if the interest array looked like this instead, we would just need to add interest.id here, assuming the ID is what we wanted to submit to the server, and then interest.name over here. Note that value is now bound to the ID, so that when I refresh and start checking checkboxes, it just shows me the ID of the item I selected. At times, you might want to use the zero-based index of the item in the collection that you're iterating over. By adding a second looping variable here and putting them both in parentheses, we can get access to that index. And for example, we could just add it as part of the label. So now we see that zero-based index in front of each name. And there are several more ways to iterate. For example, if I had an object literal with properties of an address like this, then I could add a div with v4 value key in address. And again, you can use any valid names there. It doesn't have to be value and key. But I could use this to display each property name along with its value. And if you need access to the index, you can get that here too, just by adding a third parameter. And let's try index plus 1 this time. It's also perfectly valid to remove key and index and the parentheses if you only need to use the value. And finally, you can also iterate over a range of numbers with something like v4 I in 10. Being able to set up forms and work with input values is certainly essential, but we won't be able to get very far until we learn how to handle events, which we'll get to next.